Somewhere past the last mountains at the edge of the world, the Book of Enoch describes a garden that never froze, a wall of ice around it, a single tree at its center, and people, ordinary people taken from the world before they could die, still walking its paths. The Church cut this passage from Scripture in 364 CE. Most translations soften it into poetry. But the oldest Ge'ez manuscript does not read like poetry. It reads like a man describing a place he had stood in, recording the names of who he found alive there. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the garden, Enoch says, still stands beyond the ice, the exact route he was carried to reach it, the measurements of the frozen wall that seals it off, the names of the men, the text says, are still living inside it, written out line by line in the Ge'ez. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Start with where the passage sits, because that matters. A complete Ge'ez copy of the Book of Enoch rests inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion at Axum in the Ethiopian highlands, in a manuscript collection that has not left the building in over 400 years. The account of the garden is not one passage. It is threaded through the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers, and returns again in the parables. Enoch travels. He is carried by angels to the corners of the earth, and he writes down what he sees at each corner the way a surveyor writes down what he measures. Most of what he records is bleak. Mountains of fire, a pit for the fallen, a valley of the accursed. And then, at the far northeastern edge of everything, past a region the text describes as cold and lightless, he arrives at something that does not belong there. The Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from the biblical canon in 364 CE and called it dangerous. When the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch were found among them, more than were found of most books that stayed in the Bible. Fragment 4Q, 206 from Cave 4, now held at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, carries Aramaic text from the travel chapters, carbon dated to roughly the 1st century before Christ. The garden is in there. It was in there long before any church council decided the public should not read it. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford edition remains the standard English translation for scholars, noted that these travel chapters use a kind of language that does not fit the rest of apocalyptic literature. Not symbolic geography, direction, distance, terrain. He observed that Enoch describes his route the way a traveler describes a road, turn by turn, feature by feature, not the way a prophet describes a vision. And this is where it gets disturbing, because if the route is a real route, then the place at the end of it is a real place. The path to the garden runs through cold. Chapter 34 describes Enoch carried to the north, where he sees the gates from which the frost and the ice and the killing wind pour out over the earth. This is the edge of the habitable world in the text, the place where nothing grows and nothing survives. He passes through it. He does not stop there. Chapter 32-2 says he crossed over the darkness and went far beyond it, to the east, above the mountains, and came to a place where the air itself was different. The Ge'ez word doctor, Ephraim Isaac renders in his 1983 translation from the Ethiopian manuscripts, is not merely warm. It carries the sense of preserved, held apart, kept, a pocket of living air walled off inside a dead region. Enoch walked out of the ice and into a summer that the surrounding world could not touch. What he finds there he describes plainly. Chapter 32. 3 inches, the full text reads, "And I saw a garden of righteousness, and beyond it many great trees growing there, sweet-smelling, large, very beautiful and glorious, and the tree of wisdom, of which men eat and know great wisdom." He is describing a walled enclosure of living trees inside a frozen waste. The wall is not stone. Chapter 32 inches, the Ge'ez specifies the boundary as a barrier of frost standing upright, and inside it, warmth, cold holding warmth in, the way the wall of a vault holds its contents. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the tree at the center of the garden is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Ge'ez passage, the tree of life, the fruit of wisdom. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, the tree. Chapter 24 and Chapter 25 describe it before Enoch reaches the garden itself, from a distance, standing on the 7th of 7 mountains that rise one behind the other like the tiers of a throne. He writes that its fragrance carried farther than any tree he had ever known, that its fruit resembled the dates of a palm, and that no creature of flesh was permitted to touch it until a time the angel would not name. The angel Michael, walking with him, explains the rule. Chapter 25-4 says, "This tree, no mortal is permitted to touch until the great judgment, when it will be given to the righteous and the humble, and its fruit will be food for the chosen." The tree is not decoration. It is being kept, guarded, reserved, set aside for a category of people who have not yet been allowed to eat from it. Nib pointed out something easy to miss in that passage. The rule is not that the tree is forbidden forever. The rule is that it is forbidden until a date. The whole scene is built around a delay. Something is being held back until a moment that has not yet arrived, and the tree is the physical marker of that delay, planted, guarded, and waiting exactly where Enoch found it. Nickelsburg, in his Fortress Press commentary, described the mountain of the tree as the axis of the entire journey, the fixed point everything else in the travel section is measured against. Enoch does not stumble onto the tree. He is brought to it deliberately, and shown the rule that governs it, as though the rule is the reason he was brought at all. And this is the detail that most translations quietly drop. If the fruit is being reserved for a future population, then the garden is not empty in the meantime. Somebody is maintaining it, somebody is there. And Enoch tells us who. Chapter 60 and chapter 65 both refer back to this same place, and they use a phrase the Western editions tend to flatten. The GEs describes the garden as the dwelling where the elect and the righteous dwell, where my grandfather was taken, the seventh from Adam. Enoch is the seventh from Adam. He is describing the place he himself was eventually carried to and did not leave. Genesis says it in 5 words, that Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. The Book of Enoch says where he was taken here, to the garden behind the wall of ice. And he was not the only one. The text names others. It describes the garden as inhabited by men who were removed from the world before the flood, righteous men whom God did not allow to die but instead carried out of reach and set inside the enclosure to wait. Not spirits, not souls. The Jazz uses the word for living men, bodies that breathe, and it describes them tending the trees, walking the paths, and waiting for the same judgment that will one day release the fruit of the guarded tree. Enoch is describing a small population of human beings, taken alive, kept alive, living inside a walled garden at the frozen edge of the world for thousands of years. The tradition around this only sharpens it. In the later parables, Enoch is not the last man carried into the garden. The pattern he sets is presented as a category, not an exception. The one who walks with God and does not see death is removed from the timeline of ordinary men and placed among the elect who already dwell there. Scripture keeps the pattern alive outside Enoch too. Elijah does not die. He is taken up in a whirlwind, and the text is careful to say he was not found afterward. The Book of Enoch supplies the missing address that Genesis and Kings both leave blank. It tells you there is a place these people go, that the place is real, that it has a location relative to the ice, and that the people carried there are still there. The account never once describes them coming back. And Enoch is not the only ancient culture that recorded this idea, which is what makes it hard to wave away. The Babylonians preserved almost the same story on clay. In the flood account carried in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the one man who survives the deluge, the figure the Mesopotamians called Utnapishtim, is not allowed to die at the end of it. The gods take him and his wife and place them at the mouth of the rivers, in a distant land at the edge of the world, and grant them life without end. Thorkild Jacobson, in his study of Mesopotamian cosmology, identified that distant land as Dilmun, described in the older Sumerian texts as a pure place where no living thing grows sick and no one grows old, a land set apart at the world's rim where the flood survivor was carried and kept alive, a man saved from the flood, removed from the world, placed at the edge of the earth, and never permitted to die. That is the Book of Enoch's garden told in a different language, written down by a different people, on the other side of the same event. Egypt held a version of it too. In the funerary texts, the blessed do not vanish into nothing. They are carried to the field of reeds, Seket Aru, a walled garden of water and grain sitting at the eastern horizon beyond the ordinary world, where the wheat grows taller than a man, and those admitted live on without decay. Jan Assmann, in his study of the Egyptian concept of the soul, described the field of reeds not as a vague afterlife, but as a bounded, cultivated place with gates and keepers and a location reached only by crossing a barrier the living cannot cross unaided. A walled garden at the edge of the world, holding a chosen population that no longer dies, guarded by a gate. 3 separate civilizations: Hebrew, Babylonian, and Egyptian. None of them copying the others. All describing the same structure. A garden, a wall, a boundary the living cannot pass. And people kept alive inside it, waiting. When one text says a strange thing, it is a story. When 3 unrelated traditions say the same strange thing in the same shape, using the same location at the edge of the world and the same detail of people who do not die, you are no longer looking at a story. You are looking at a memory, preserved 3 different ways, of something the ancient world believed was a real place with a real population inside it. The standard English editions do not put it this way. R. H. Charles, whose 1906 translation most people still quote, rendered the inhabitants of the garden as the spirits of the righteous, past tense, dead, waiting in a spiritual holding place. But Dr. Ephraim Isaac, translating directly from the Ethiopian Ge'ez in 1983, flagged the choice. The Ge'ez does not say spirits, it says the living. Charles inserted a theology the text does not contain. He turned a garden full of living men into a metaphor for the afterlife, because a metaphor is safe and a garden full of living men is not. Dr. George Nicholsburg, in his commentary on Enoch, made a related point about these chapters. He noted that the travel section treats the garden as a location on the map of the earth, positioned relative to real directions and real features, not as a heaven above the sky. It sits at the edge of the world, not above it. It is reachable. That is exactly what made it a problem. A heaven you cannot walk to threatens no one. A garden you could theoretically sail toward is a testable claim, and testable claims are the ones institutions bury. Dr. James Vanderkam, working through the manuscript tradition decades later, added that the garden chapters preserve older material than the sections around them. The place, in other words, was not a late invention bolted onto the book. It is one of the oldest layers of the entire Enochic tradition, older than the parables, possibly older than the flood narrative it sits next to. Whatever the garden is, the memory of it is among the oldest things the text carries. What Enoch describes, when you stop softening it, is a preserved biosphere. A warm, living enclosure sealed off inside a lethal cold region, walled by ice, centered on a single protected tree, maintained by a population of human beings who were removed from ordinary human history and never returned to it. And the strange thing is how closely the shape of that claim matches something the modern world only recently learned it could build. In 2008, on the island of Spitsbergen, roughly 800 miles from the North Pole, a vault was cut into the side of a frozen mountain. It is called the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Its entire purpose is to keep living things alive through catastrophe. Hundreds of millions of seeds, the genetic material of nearly every food crop on Earth, sealed behind blast doors inside permafrost that keeps them viable for centuries without power. The cold is not the threat, the cold is the lock. Engineers chose the coldest, most remote place they could reach precisely because that is where living things keep the longest. A living archive, walled by ice, at the frozen edge of the inhabited world, kept for a future generation that has not arrived yet. Enoch described the concept, in almost the same terms, more than 2,000 years before anyone poured the first door. And it is not the only one. Beneath the permafrost of the Norwegian Arctic sits a second vault, this one holding not seeds but the world's data, spooled onto film rated to survive 1,000 years in the cold. Deep under a mountain in the same region, a global archive stores the records humanity most wants to outlast it. The instinct is identical every time. When people build something meant to survive the end of the world and reach a future they will never see, they carry it north, and they bury it in ice. Enoch wrote down that instinct as an accomplished fact thousands of years before the first modern engineer acted on it. And it is not only storage. Cryobiologists now keep human tissue, whole organs in early trials, and viable cells frozen for decades, and revive them intact. The principle they work from is the one the garden runs on. Cold does not only kill, held at the right threshold, cold suspends. It stops the clock. A body kept cold enough, in the right conditions, does not age on the same timeline as a body in the warm world. Enoch describes men who were placed at the frozen edge of the earth and did not die across thousands of years. He had no word for suspended animation. He had no laboratory. He described the result and left the mechanism for someone else to name. Then there is the tree at the center. And here the parallel gets sharper. Around the world sit botanical vaults built for exactly one job, to keep a single lineage of plant life from ever being lost. The Millennium Seed Bank in England alone holds the seed of tens of thousands of wild plant species against the day any of them vanishes from the wild. And the oldest living individual trees on Earth, the bristlecone pines of the White Mountains, have stood for close to 5,000 years, alive the entire time, older than the pyramids, still producing seed. Enoch describes a single tree, older than the settled world, kept alive and guarded, its fruit sealed until a future date. We now know that a tree can in fact live that long. We now know that a single protected specimen can outlast every civilization built around it. The text was not describing an impossibility. It was describing something that, as it turns out, the earth actually permits. The suppression of these chapters follows the same road as the rest of Enoch, and it is worth walking. The Council of Laodicea removed the book in 364 CE. Jerome, assembling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed the travel chapters as confused and unworthy of study, without once addressing how a Bronze Age writer knew that the far north was a region of killing cold with living land beyond it. Augustine, in the City of God around 410 CE, argued that the garden passages were borrowed pagan myth and did not explain the borrowing. The pattern is consistent. Every authority that dismissed the garden dismissed the where of it, the location, the route, the wall, and never the theology. Theology was never the problem. Coordinates were the problem. The Ethiopian Church, operating apart from Rome, kept the full text. When the Scottish traveler James Bruce carried 3 GE's manuscripts back to Europe in 1773, the garden chapters drew immediate argument among Oxford scholars, who called the living enclosure at the edge of the ice irreconcilable with accepted geography. R. H. Charles, in a footnote to his 1906 edition, suggested the garden was a garbled memory of some real northern place a traveler had once described. He offered no traveler and no place. He simply needed the passage to mean less than it said. There is a further layer most researchers never reach. When Joseph Millick published his landmark edition of the Aramaic Enoch fragments in 1976, the travel chapters describing the garden and its inhabitants were given low priority and thin commentary. Millick described the garden material as later mythological elaboration with no geographical content, the same verdict Charles had reached from the opposite direction. The two men disagreed about almost everything, and agreed on one thing, that the garden did not need to be looked at closely. And so, for decades, it was not. The single most specific account of a preserved living place in the entire Enochic corpus was handled by the men who controlled access to it as though it were the least important thing in the book. Direct examination of the source became harder still after 1974. Following the Ethiopian Revolution, the new government classified the church archives at Axum as national cultural property and closed them. Dr. James Vanderkam of Notre Dame, among the foremost living authorities on Enoch, is one of several scholars who have noted that certain passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known only through secondary references and have not been available for direct study in over 50 years. The version of the garden chapters that most closely describes the living inhabitants is, according to that tradition, among the passages that Western scholarship has never been permitted to photograph in full. What we work from in English is a copy of a copy, edited by men who had already decided what it was allowed to mean. And here is where it stops being only ancient. The polar regions Enoch places his garden beyond are the same regions the modern world keeps quietly mapping and then classifying. Ice-penetrating radar surveys flown over the Antarctic interior in recent years have returned readings of liquid water and stable, sealed environments hundreds of feet beneath solid ice, cut off from the surface for spans of time measured in the hundreds of thousands of years. When teams drilled down into one of those buried lakes, Lake Vostok, sealed under more than 2 miles of ice, the samples they pulled up carried genetic traces of living things that had no match in any known catalog, organisms sealed away from the surface world so long that they had become something the surface no longer had a name for. A living population, walled off by ice, kept in isolation across an unimaginable stretch of time, still alive when the drill finally reached it. That is not the garden. But it is the shape of the garden, found exactly where the text said to look, in the coldest sealed places on Earth, and every one of those results now sits behind the same wall of restricted access and delayed publication that the manuscripts themselves sit behind. Now, let me be clear about what I am and am not saying. I am not telling you there is a heated garden behind a literal wall of ice near the North Pole, with immortal men from before the flood tending an apple tree. The Book of Enoch is not a satellite photograph, but when you strip the fear out of the reading and take the text at its plain word, what it describes is a preserved living enclosure, sealed by cold, centered on a single guarded organism, holding life in suspension for a future that has not yet come. And that specific concept, which sounded like pure fantasy for most of human history, is now something the modern world has actually built into the side of an Arctic mountain and filled with living material meant to outlast us. Enoch had no vault, no cryobiology, no permafrost engineering, no seed bank. He should not be able to describe a cold-sealed living archive at the edge of the world reserved for a later generation. He describes it anyway, in Ge'ez and in Aramaic, in fragments recovered at Qumran, and in a manuscript locked inside a church at Axum, saying what it has said for more than 2,000 years. Either it is a symbol so precise that it accidentally predicted a piece of 21st century engineering, or Enoch was shown a real place, and he wrote it down the way you would write down the address of somewhere you had been. What lingers, once you have read it in the older text rather than the edited one, is how ordinary Enoch's tone stays the whole way through. He does not marvel. He does not preach. He walks past the gates of the killing cold, crosses a darkness the surrounding world cannot survive, and steps into a warm garden full of living men, and he writes it down the way you would note the layout of a building you were shown once and told to remember. He records the wall. He records the tree and the rule that governs it. He records that the people there were taken before the flood and are living still. And then he leaves, and the account closes the gate behind him, and every source that has handled the passage since has spent its energy trying to make those plain sentences mean something less alarming than what they say. The men who translated it needed it to be a symbol. The councils that removed it needed it to be nothing at all. But the text never once behaves like a symbol. It behaves like a report. The tree still stands at the center of the account. The wall of frost still surrounds it in the text. The men Enoch names are still listed as living, still waiting, still tending the paths on the far side of the ice. The fragment sits under glass in Jerusalem. The full manuscript sits behind stone and government seal at Axum. The seed vault sits open and operating on Spitsbergen, doing in steel and permafrost the exact thing the garden was said to do in frost and living wood. And in a book the church removed from scripture 17 centuries ago, a man named Enoch stands past the last of the ice, inside a garden that should not exist, writing down the names of the people he found still alive in it, telling us that the gate has not yet been opened, that they are still there, and that they are waiting for the day it finally is. The story does not end with a monster or a final warning. It ends with a garden that was never destroyed, a tree that was never cut down, and a small band of people who were carried out of the reach of death and told to wait, and who, by the oldest words we still have, are waiting there still.